India's balancing act has been put to test during the G20 foreign ministers meet and the Raisina dialogue. Hello and a very warm welcome to World 360. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Now, with world leaders having gathered in New Delhi, what have these meets achieved and what have they meant for a polarized world of today? And is India now the voice of a global South? We'll delve deeper in this special presentation on India's global leadership. But first up are the headlines. The Biden administration approves the sale for F-16 fighter jets worth over $600 million to Taiwan in a move which will further inflame the already heightened tensions across the Indo-Pacific as China builds up military pressure on the Taiwanese island. The US President Joe Biden had a cancerous skin lesion removed last month during a routine health screening. Biden's longtime physician has confirmed that all cancerous tissues have been successfully removed from his chest. India concluded a mega diplomatic blitz with G20. Quad foreign ministers meet and the Raisina dialogue in New Delhi this week. While the G20 foreign ministers failed to procure a communique, the G20 chair released an outcome document citing the agreement of all diplomats on almost 90% of the issues excluding Ukraine war. The Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu pays a rare visit to Russian troops deployed in Ukraine at a time Russia is desperate for territorial gain in Ukraine's east. Now, India has concluded a 3-day-long diplomatic blitzkrieg with the G20 foreign ministers meet and Quad foreign ministers meeting in New Delhi. Although the G20 foreign ministers failed to come up with a joint communique due to sharp polarization among the members on the Russia-Ukraine war. Consensus was achieved on over 90% of these issues, so the summit's chair released a summary and outcome document. To start with, the G20 Foreign Ministers Summit, the Foreign Ministers of India, Dr. S. Jaishankar, had a marathon schedule. First, he held bilateral talks with US Secretary of State Antony Blinken, focusing on bilateral ties and pressing global issues, including the Ukraine conflict. The US Secretary of State used this opportunity to arrange a short and unexpected meeting with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, making it their first official meet since the beginning of Ukraine's invasion.
I spoke briefly with Russia's Foreign Minister Lavrov on the margins of our G20 meeting today. I urged Russia to reverse its irresponsible decision and return to implementing the New START Treaty, which places verifiable limits on the nuclear arsenals of the United States and the Russian Federation. I told the Foreign Minister what I and so many others said last week at the United Nations and what so many G20 foreign ministers said today. End this war of aggression. Engage in meaningful diplomacy that can produce a just and durable peace. The United States stand ready to support Ukraine through diplomacy to end the war on this basis.
But the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov did not shy away from putting up a verbal fight. Lavrov launched a barrage of attacks on the United States during this multilateral geopolitical conference, Raisina dialogue, which took place in New Delhi just a day after the G20 foreign ministers meet. A boisterous international audience both cheered and groaned as Lavrov presented Russia's view of the Ukraine war, reflecting global splits on this crisis.
Have you been interested during these years what is going on in Iraq, what is going on in Afghanistan? Have you been asking the United States and NATO whether they are certain of what they are doing? When they now Scholz, Baerbock, Macron and others say this is the first time when the OSCE Helsinki Final Act is being violated. Joe Biden, being a senator at that time, he was bragging that 1 year before the bombing of Serbia, I promoted this approach. And I believe that we have to bomb them out into peace.
And soon after the meeting with Blinken on the sidelines of the G20 foreign ministers meet, Jaishankar went into a meeting with his Chinese counterpart Qin Gang at the same venue. After the bilateral, External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar highlighted the abnormal state of ties and the need for peace at the LAC in his talks on Thursday with the Chinese counterpart Qin Gang. China's Foreign Minister Qin Gang released a statement calling on India to put the border issue in the proper place.
We spent, I don't know, maybe about 45 minutes talking to each other. And the bulk of our conversation, understandably, was about the current state of our relationship. There are real problems in that relationship that need to be looked at, that need to be discussed very openly and candidly between us.
So how did the foreign ministers meet and the Raisina dialogue pan out? And for that, I'm joined in by our managing editor, Zaka Jacob, who's joining me live from the newsroom. Zaka, thank you for joining in. Now, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, has attacked the West by comparing the fallout of Ukraine's war with that of Iraq and Yugoslavia. In fact, many other foreign policy experts have also questioned why the West did not react in a similar fashion for Afghanistan or Syria.
So you're right in as much as the second part of your question. There have been multiple wars in the past, including in the current century. You've had the wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria, and somehow those wars have not had the kind of impact or fallout that the Russia-Ukraine war has had. Now, you could argue that's because, war has literally come to Europe's doorsteps. It's happening on mainland Europe. It's happening in continental Europe. The first war of this nature since World War II. So therefore, the Europeans are extremely exercised by it, and they feel very strongly about this, that Russia needs to be pushed back against in a very, very firm way. There have been European politicians who even compared Vladimir Putin to a modern-day Hitler. So yes, from the European point of view, because this war is happening on their continent and perhaps the first big war,
right.
Yes, wars have happened in Europe as well. The Balkan War, for example, in the 1990s. But none of that reached this scale because for the first time since World War II, a major power is involved.
Right. Many thanks to you, Zaka, for bringing in those inputs. Now, it's been called the Great Divide that's placed Russia and China on one end versus a united West on the other, with India playing the balancing act. Let's also try and get a deeper sense of perspective. And for that, let me also introduce our esteemed panelists. I'm joined in by Manju Seth, who is a former diplomat, joins me live from New Delhi. Fred Ware is a Russian political affairs expert, joining me live from Moscow. Edward P. Joseph is an expert on EU and US political affairs, also a lecturer at Johns Hopkins SAIS. He joins us live from Washington. I'm also joined in by Andrew K.P. Lung, who's a geopolitical strategist from China. Fred, if I could begin with you. Russia's foreign minister has spoken extensively about how NATO has broken all commitments, especially with regards to eastern expansion close to Russia. Weighing in on what he said, do you think this indicates that Russia is in for a protracted war?
I think we are in for a long and very difficult war. We'll know better by summer. Because there are battlefield events coming up, and depending on how they turn out, we'll probably have a better idea of how the two sides feel about the idea of negotiating. But right now, it's impossible. There is absolutely no common ground in their positions, and they both seem to think they can win on the battlefield, and therefore, I'm sorry to say, I hate to say this, but that's where it's going in the next few months. The G20 didn't, of course, reach the ability to have a joint communique, and that is because of this new Cold War. This war is even worse in some ways than the previous Cold War, this war of words between Western countries and Russia and to some extent China. It's a pity because the G20 is a much larger forum, and it contains many countries of the global south. In fact, India is chairing it, and they have a completely different agenda.
All All right. Edward, if I could bring you in, the West has been accused of derailing the G20's development agenda by focusing on the war in Ukraine. Your thoughts?
Akanksha, I'm so glad you asked me that, and I can address each one of these if you want, and I can explain very quickly and concisely why there's no comparison whatsoever. Look, let's take war in Yugoslavia. You know, I was there during the war for 12 years in all the conflicts. I can tell you, as truly from on the ground perspective and widely known expertise on that region, there's absolutely no comparison. This was a 78-day NATO air campaign that specifically targeted some bridges and military infrastructure and deliberately avoided any civilian infrastructure. And why did NATO even attack? Because Slobodan Milosevic had unilaterally revoked Kosovo's autonomy, instituted a decade of repression when Kosovo was led by a pacifist and for years lacked many arms. And Milosevic destabilized the region in a similar way that Putin has done in Ukraine and refused to negotiate in good faith. The US and EU, all they asked was restore Kosovo's autonomy. No one insisted that Kosovo become independent. So there's absolutely no comparison. There was a deliberate effort to avoid civilian casualties. We see the opposite by Russia, the exact opposite, premeditated aggression. There was no threat. There were conversations with Russia at high levels to try to address any concerns it had. And it has deliberately, brutally tried to attack civilians, even threatening nuclear power plants, which would be a disaster for the world. So there's simply no comparison. Iraq war, look, it was a mistake. Right. The U.S. made a mistake invading. But what happens in democracies when there's a mistake? There's accountability. Barack Obama was elected in 2008. He won the nomination over Hillary Clinton because of his opposition.
Absolutely. In fact, I agree with you when it comes to accountability by democracy. But having said that, Manju Seth, if I could bring you in on this, as Prime Minister Modi said, the world witnessed a failure of multilateralism. Has the G20 foreign ministers meet helped in communicating those issues which were also part of the agenda apart from the war?
China and Russia were on one side with the US on the other, and the other countries. And India, despite its best efforts to find a via media, was unable to do so because their positions were very, very, sort of hardened. And as the Russian foreign minister, he also mentioned that things have changed. You know, when he was told, it was asked that, you agree to the same wording or the same similar kind of paragraphs in the Bali agreement.
Yes.
He said that more than 6 months have passed and many other sort of events have taken place. And he said the situation is very different and now we cannot agree to those statements.
Okay. Andrew K.P. Lung, when we speak about this failure of multilateralism, China's state mouthpiece, the Global Times, has said that the West weaponized G20 to hijack the development agenda that the G20 is also supposed to focus on. Why so?
According to Goldman Sachs research, by the year 2027, by the year 2075, the top 8 largest economies in the world, including only one Western country, the United States, by that time already descended into the 3rd position after China and India. All the rest are what are now developing countries. So the world is changing, but it doesn't mean it also changed the reality that the world is dominated by a single hegemon, which is the United States since the Second World War. So the world is becoming more multipolar. But the lack of a agreed statement in the G20 doesn't mean the end of a multilateralism. Is on the other hand, it signifies a change from unipolarity to multipolarity, because a multipolar world doesn't mean that all the countries would agree with one another. Whereas a hegemonic world, of course, the hegemon can dictate the terms all the time. But this is changing.
Right. Fred, now the absence of a joint communique is an indication of the failure of that multilateralism. Did the West, in fact, weaponize G20, something that the Global Times has written about? Do you agree with that?
I don't know. We overuse that word weaponize, don't we? But they definitely were trying very hard to inject their agenda into it. And their agenda is everybody get on the bandwagon of attacking Russia, isolating Russia, punishing Russia. And so they will use every forum. I mean, I'm sure you've noticed every single forum that comes up turns into this kind of shouting match between these two positions, and everything else gets blotted out. This is just the way it's been going, and I think India did a skillful job actually in trying. I mean, you couldn't get a final communique that everybody agreed on, obviously, but a lot of progress probably was made, especially behind the scenes, and India did insist on a wider agenda.
All right, Manju Seth, let's quickly also discuss the situation at the LAC, which was also brought up in the bilateral between India and China. Dr. S. Jaishankar was clear in his messaging to China when it comes to the LAC. At the same time, the Chinese foreign minister spokesperson, Mao Ning, said that China attaches great importance to India. What should be expected from Beijing now in terms of security at the LAC?
They will, at the moment, I think, like, when our joint secretary had gone to Beijing recently, there seemed to be some positivity. And, but, as we have seen, on major issues, I don't think there'll be too much of movement. There will be some movement, there'll be some, talks, and there will be some give and take, should I say, or give by the Chinese side. And to find a resolution to some of the friction points. But not on all. I don't expect as yet any resolution to come on all the friction points which are in India's interest. And China is saying that yes, we attach great importance, but I think their motive is more to keep us prevent us from taking any great action on bringing down the trade between the two countries and to bring down our trade deficit. I think their focus is always on that India, whatever's happening on the LAC should not drastically affect the bilateral trade. And when I say bilateral trade, we know that the trade deficit is we have a great trade deficit and the trade is in favor of China. And China would not like to see a drastic fall in its exports to India.
Right. I'd also like to know what Andrew thinks about this. Andrew, do you think that the G20 foreign ministers meet arrived as a step in the right direction when it comes to addressing the issues at the LAC?
Well, I think the current situation in Ukraine is hijacking everything else because it's regarded as an existential war between the United States-led coalition against Russia. And both sides are not backing down. And then the repercussions are affecting the rest of the world, not least the developing countries. So the G20, even though it's not an appropriate forum to address all security issues, the forum has been hijacked and there's no getting away with it. And that's why it's difficult to get an agreed statement, resulting in the chairman in India issuing a chairman's summary only. This just reflects the reality.
Fred, do you also agree with Andrew that the forum got hijacked? How did the G20 go? Was it on expected lines? How do you assess India's balancing act?
I think that, you see, what I think would be a failure is if people listened to the calls from the West to expel Russia from the G20. This is the dangerous thing. Otherwise, the G20 is a big, flexible instrument. It was designed to bring together many different voices, many different parts of the world. It's not like the G7, which is like a forum of like-minded countries. G20 was meant to be like this, and it perhaps never faced a crisis as bad as this one. I think it's managing pretty well. And if, I mean, as I said, no communique was possible, no reconciliation on this point.
All right, Edward, I'd like to end with your thoughts. How do you see the Quad foreign ministers meet panning out? How do you also view New Delhi's growing role in the Quad, especially when it comes to countering China in the Indo-Pacific? And will this have implications on the existing LAC situation between India and China?
There's not even any need anymore to acknowledge the role, the critical role that India plays, along with its Quad partners in addressing the threat that comes from China. And here I have to emphasize that shared concern that India, Australia, the United States, Japan have, and we should add South Korea and Taiwan, have about China's aggression is completely linked with the Russian aggression of Ukraine. In several respects, China is the number one backer and sustainer of Russia's invasion. We have to understand that. It's so important for your viewers to understand that if China were to cease backing Russia, this war would be over.
Right. Right. Many thanks to you, to all of you, in fact, for sharing in your precious insights. And with that, I slip into a quick break. Don't go anywhere, because more global news and updates, especially with regards to what happened in India, follow after this short break. Stay tuned.